In this video, we're going to go over how you can use a RAML file in SOATest to create a test suite. A RAML file is essentially a description language for RESTful services. It's very similar to how a visual is used to describe SOAP services. In a similar sense, a RAML file includes all operations that are part of that service. Okay, so let's create a new test. I'm going to go to General and Add New. Call this Service. So the procedure is very similar to how you would create it from a visual file. Instead of choosing SOA, I would go to REST. And even inside REST, if you have another type of description language such as a Swagger file or Waddle file, you can go ahead and use that also. I'm going to select RAML and hit Next. Select my RAML file. Now when I hit Finish, what SOATest is going to do is parse through that RAML file, is going to see what operations are described, and for each of those operations is going to create a separate test. So now let's open the test. You can see service.tst is created. It's created two things, environments and a test suite. First, let me go through the test suite. There are two tests here. One is called users and one is accounts, account ID and calls. In the users, there's one request message that goes out and it's a GET request. And if I double click, you can see it's all populated. What SOATest does, it takes a look at the request URL, and if it's a GET request, it's going to see if there's a URL path that's specified or any URL parameters. And under query, you can see this requires a parameter called page and per page. And it creates a form view for it, so it's easier to add data to it. And you can parameterize and data drive these also. So let's run this test. And you can see this test finished. The test succeeded. I can take a look at the traffic. This was my request. It didn't have a payload, but it did have the request URL. And this is the response I got back. Essentially, information about certain users. Now, if I go back to this message, because this is a GET request, it doesn't really have a payload. But we can go into the HTTP options and see a couple of things, essentially around security. So most RESTful services have some sort of security. Either you can pass a client-side certificate, HTTP authentication, or OAuth authentication. All of this can be added. And let me go to the next test. This one is a post request. You can see the URL does have some information that needs to be added, essentially account SID. But because this is a post request, it also requires a payload. And the payload request message has been described in the RAML file. And what SOATest does is, instead of giving you the literal XML or JSON, it creates a form view out of it. In this case, you're sending a phone number. And again, you can data drive and parameterize your payload. The last thing I just want to mention is SOATest also creates this environments file, which is essentially the URL that's been described in the RAML file. Now the advantage here is that if you want to change the URL, you just have to change it in one point, which is the environment variable. Or if you want to create multiple versions of the environment, such as different URLs for production, development, and testing, you can go ahead and do that easily. So that is how to create a test suite in SOATest using a RAML file.